1547. Hours, 12th October 1943. Over the North Sea waters of the English Channel. Lieutenant James Howell, a 24-year-old U.S. AAF pilot of the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, was gripping the control stick white-knuckled at the controls of his aircraft, call sign Jersey 27. He plunged toward the frigid sea alongside a bullet-riddled B-17 Flying Fortress bomber ahead of him. His fighter's engines had cut out completely, the fuel gauge needle pinned firmly at zero. Gale force, bone-chilling high-altitude air screamed through two gaping holes in the fuselage, torn open by direct hits from German cannon fire. Up ahead, only two of the B-17's engines sputtered along for dear life, its fuselage pockmarked with shrapnel and bullet holes. Its nose locked in a 15-degree dive angle, the bomber was on an irreversible collision course with the sea below. No one could have imagined that this fighter pilot, who could have returned safely to the British mainland with his formation, would choose to defy orders, using his last remaining fuel and ammunition to carve out a 90-mile corridor of life-or-death cover for this straggling bomber. Even fewer could have foreseen that this desperate escort mission, which began over the Rhineland, would end in the tragic, heroic spectacle of both aircraft crash-landing in the North Sea. Yet the story of it all began 6 hours earlier at RAF Thorpe Abbotts Airfield in the United Kingdom. In 1943, the Western Front of the Second World War in Europe had entered the bloodiest phase of the strategic bombing stalemate. The U.S. 8th Air Force remained committed to its daylight precision bombing strategy, seeking to fundamentally cripple Nazi Germany's war-making capacity through pinpoint strikes on the core of its military-industrial infrastructure. At the very heart of this strategic bombing campaign were the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. More than 60% of the high-precision ball bearings used across Germany's industrial system were manufactured at these facilities. Were the plants to be completely destroyed, production of all German heavy equipment, tanks, fighter aircraft, warships, and every other mechanized weapon of war would grind to a total halt. To defend this lifeline of its military industry, the German military deployed over 300 large-caliber anti-aircraft guns around Schweinfurt, constructing an impenetrable ground-based air defense network. At the same time, it amassed the most elite fighter units on the Western Front, poised to launch devastating interceptions against incoming U.S. bomber formations. The unit tasked with this fateful bombing mission was the 100th Bombardment Group of the U.S. 8th Air Force, a unit that had amassed a staggering casualty record on the Western Front. 77% of its air crews that departed on missions never returned to the airfield. For this, it earned a chilling nickname within the U.S. military, the Bloody Hundredth. The 100th Bombardment Group comprised 4 bomber squadrons, each equipped with 8 to 12 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers. For this mission, the entire 8th Air Force fielded a total of 320 B-17 bombers, formed into a massive combat box formation, and headed deep into the heart of Germany. Providing escort for the bomber fleet were U.S. AAF P-47 Thunderbolt fighter units, including Lieutenant James Howell's Jersey 27. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a 4-engine, heavy bomber developed by Boeing for the U.S. military. It boasted a fuselage length of 22.66 meters, a wingspan of 31.62 meters, and a maximum takeoff weight of 29.7 tons. It was powered by 4 Wright R1820 radial engines, each delivering a maximum output of 1,200 horsepower, with a maximum service ceiling of 35,000 feet, a cruising speed of 150 knots, and a maximum range of 2,000 miles when fully loaded. What made this bomber most feared, however, was its phenomenal defensive firepower. The aircraft was fitted with a total of 13 12.7mm Browning heavy machine guns, mounted in the nose, top turret, ball turret, tail turret, and left and right waist positions, creating a 360-degree crossfire defensive network with zero blind spots. With its rugged, reinforced airframe and dense defensive firepower, the B-17 became the most iconic heavy bomber of World War II, even earning the moniker the Flying Steel Fortress from German forces. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, tasked with escorting the bombers, was a legendary design from Republic Aviation. It had a fuselage length of 11.02 meters, a wingspan of 12.43 meters, and a maximum takeoff weight of 7.93 tons. It was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP 18-cylinder radial engine, cranking out a maximum output of 2,000 horsepower, with a maximum level flight speed of 433 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 42,000 feet. The core strengths of this fighter were its extreme durability and devastating firepower. It was armed with 8 12.7mm Browning heavy machine guns housed within the wings, with 425 rounds of ammunition per gun. A single salvo could unleash a withering, destructive hail of fire in an instant. Meanwhile, the airframe featured armor plating up to 12 millimeters thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from German 20-millimeter cannon fire, cementing its reputation as the toughest, most damage-resistant piston engine fighter of World War II. Yet the fighter had one fatal flaw: insufficient range. Even when fitted with drop tanks, its maximum escort radius was just 175 miles. It could only escort the bomber fleet to the German border before it had to turn back, or risk running out of fuel and being unable to return to the British mainland. Early on the morning of October 12, 1943, the deafening roar of piston engines shook the ground at RAF Thorpe Abbotts Airfield in England. A B-17 bomber, tail number 42-3067, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Hayes, slowly taxied toward the runway. The bomber carried a crew of 10, pilot Lieutenant Hayes, co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Morrison, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, top turret gunner, ball turret gunner Martinez, left and right waist gunners, and tail turret gunner. Every man had completed their final pre-flight checks, ammunition was chambered and loaded, the bomb bay was filled with high-explosive aerial bombs, and the fuel tanks were topped off to full capacity. Each and every one of them knew that this bombing mission, deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, was a gamble against overwhelming odds. At that same moment, on the other side of the airfield, Lieutenant James Howell had already climbed into the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, call sign Jersey 27. At 24 years old, he was a seasoned fighter pilot with 312 hours of combat flight time and 72 combat missions under his belt. He ran through checks of the aircraft's fuel gauges, machine gun ammo belts, and engine status, then gave a thumbs up to the ground crew. His orders were clear: escort the bomber fleet to the German border, rendezvous with the formation on their return after they completed their bomb runs, follow combat protocol to the letter, never break formation without authorization, and under no circumstances penetrate deep into German-occupied airspace to avoid disaster from fuel starvation. At 8:15 hours that morning, 320 B-17 bombers took off in sequence, rendezvousing and assembling over the east coast of England into a massive combat box formation, before setting a course for the German mainland. Close on their heels were hundreds of P-47 fighters, fanning out around the bomber formation to form an escort screen, their eyes scanning every corner of the sky for threats. As the Armada crossed the English Channel and entered German-occupied French airspace, German radar stations on the ground had already picked up the massive formation signal. Intelligence was rapidly relayed to the German Luftwaffe's Western Front Air Defense Command, and a hunting operation targeting the American bomber fleet was already quietly underway. This time, the Americans suffered a catastrophic intelligence failure. They had predicted the Germans would be able to scramble a maximum of 200 fighters to intercept the formation. In reality, through their intelligence network, the Germans had obtained advance warning of the Americans' bombing target and mission timeline. They had amassed over 400 Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters at multiple airfields across the Rhineland, Belgium, and northern France, laying a deadly dragnet that stretched all the way from the German border to Schweinfurt. The Germans had devised a tailored interception tactic. First, use small formations to carry out hit-and-run harassment attacks, burning through the escort fighters' fuel and ammunition. Once the P-47s were forced to turn back due to their range limits, they would concentrate their full force to launch wave after wave of devastating strikes against the now unprotected bomber fleet. At 11:30 hours, the bomber formation reached the airspace over the German border. Per the pre-planned mission profile, the escorting P-47 fighters had hit their maximum escort radius, their fuel gauges now at the mandatory return threshold. The lead commander issued the order to turn back, and hundreds of P-47s peeled off the formation, one by one, wheeling around to head for the British mainland. Lieutenant James Howell was among the returning formation. He glanced back at the massive bomber fleet behind him, with no way of knowing that, just hours later, he would reverse course and charge alone back into this killing zone. The moment the P-47 escort formation departed, the German hunting operation began in earnest. Over 400 German fighters, split into dozens of attack groups, descended on the unprotected bomber fleet from every direction. The Germans employed their deadliest tactic, the head-on attack. Diving straight toward the oncoming bomber formation at a closing speed of over 500 knots, they unleashed their nose-mounted 20mm cannon fire directly at the B-17's most vulnerable point, the nose cockpit. This attack method carried extreme risk. With two aircraft flying directly toward each other, the firing window for both pilots was less than a single second, and the slightest miscalculation would result in a mid-air collision. At the same time, however, this tactic perfectly bypassed the B-17's heaviest concentration of defensive fire in the tail, allowing for devastating strikes on the bombers. The skies over the Rhineland were instantly turned into an aerial slaughterhouse. The thunder of 20mm cannon blasts, the staccato roar of 12.7mm machine guns, the deafening explosions of stricken aircraft, and the high-pitched shriek of failing engines filled the entire airspace. One B-17 after another was ripped apart by German cannon fire. Some had their wings sheared clean off, disintegrating in a mid-air fireball. Others suffered engine fires, plummeting toward the ground, trailing thick plumes of black smoke. Still more had their fuselages riddled with shrapnel, leaving crewmen inside dead or wounded. The German attacks came wave after wave, giving the bomber fleet no room to breathe. The defensive fire network of the combat box formation was torn apart piece by piece in the face of the Germans' overwhelming numerical superiority. By this time, Lieutenant Hayes's B-17 had followed the formation to the skies over Schweinfurt. The bombardier opened the bomb bay doors, locking onto the ball-bearing factories below. At that exact moment, German flak guns on the ground opened up with a ferocious barrage. Countless black flak bursts erupted all around the bomber formation, razor-sharp shrapnel sweeping through the B-17's fuselage like a torrential downpour. With a deafening crack, a flak round exploded just off the B-17's left fuselage. Shrapnel tore straight through the aircraft's skin and into the left waist gunner's compartment. Gunner Martinez was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel, critically wounded and knocked unconscious instantly. The other waist gunner was also slashed by shrapnel, bleeding profusely. In an instant, the B-17's left defensive firepower was completely neutralized. Lieutenant Hayes gripped the control stick with all his might, fighting to hold the bomber's flight attitude, and shouted over the intercom for the bombardier to complete the drop. Seconds later, the full load of high-explosive aerial bombs released from the bomb bay, plummeting toward the target on the ground. The moment the bombs were away, Hayes immediately pushed the control column forward, guiding the bomber off the bombing run and into the returning formation, setting a course for the British mainland. But by now, his B-17 had sustained heavy damage across the airframe. Its fuselage was pockmarked with bullet holes. Its hydraulic system was leaking. The number 3 engine was spiking in temperature. 2 gunners were wounded, and its defensive firepower was drastically reduced. It had become the weakest link in the formation and the prime target for German fighter pilots. Disaster struck again on the return flight. 4 FW-190 fighters had locked onto the already damaged B-17, launching a diving attack from the blind spot off the bomber's rear quarter. 20mm cannon rounds streaked through the air like fiery streams, raking across the B-17's fuselage and wings. The tail turret gunner immediately opened fire in retaliation, the top turret swinging around rapidly to unleash a dense hail of rounds at the incoming FW-190s. The two sides exchanged furious gunfire at 23,000 feet. The B-17's crossfire found its mark on the lead FW-190, its engine bursting into flames instantly before it plummeted toward the ground trailing black smoke. But the remaining 3 FW-190s refused to break off, instead launching a second attack. A single 20mm cannon round scored a direct hit on the B-17's number 3 engine. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, and the number 3 engine was instantly engulfed in flames. The fuel lines inside the engine had been torn open by the cannon round, sending aviation fuel gushing out and feeding the blaze, which quickly consumed the entire engine nacelle. Co-pilot Lieutenant Morrison immediately hit the fire suppression switch, flooding the engine compartment with extinguishing agent and barely containing the flames. But the number 3 engine was completely seized up, its propeller frozen mid-spin. Even more catastrophically, the same cannon round had torn through the bomber's hydraulic lines. The hydraulic fluid drained away in an instant, crippling the bomber's ability to control its flaps, rudder, and elevators. The nose of the aircraft immediately dropped into a 15-degree dive, beginning a steady altitude loss of 200 feet per minute. Lieutenant Hayes fought with every ounce of strength alongside co-pilot Morrison, hauling back on the control stick in a desperate attempt to level out the bomber's flight attitude. But with one engine lost and its hydraulic system completely inoperable, the nearly 30-ton flying fortress could no longer maintain the altitude and speed required to keep up with the formation. Its maximum indicated airspeed could only hold at 160 knots, while the formation's cruising speed was 180 knots. The gap between them widened with every passing second. Over the radio, the formation commander issued Hayes a direct order: either keep up with the formation or abandon the aircraft and bail out. He was forbidden from slowing the entire formation's return flight. Per USAAF combat regulations, a severely damaged bomber, unable to keep pace with the formation, had to be left behind. To slow or hold the entire formation would be to invite swarms of additional German fighters, resulting in far greater losses. The main bomber formation did not hesitate for a single moment. It accelerated toward the British mainland, vanishing into the cloud cover within seconds. Hayes' B-17 was now completely cut off, alone in the sky. At that moment, the bomber was flying over the Rhineland in Germany, still 140 miles from the British mainland. Below it lay German-occupied French territory, and all around it, German fighters and ground-based anti-aircraft guns lurked everywhere. Of the bomber's original 4 engines, only 3 remained operational, one of which was leaking fuel continuously. Its fuselage was riddled with bullet and shrapnel holes. Its hydraulic system was completely inoperable, and its bomb bay doors were stuck half open due to the hydraulic failure, drastically increasing aerodynamic drag. 2 of its gunners were wounded, with ball turret gunner Martinez still unconscious, leaving its defensive firepower drastically crippled. With no escort and no formation cover, This B-17 had become easy prey for German fighter pilots. It was only a matter of time before it was shot down. The navigator reported their current position and flight status to Lieutenant Hayes, urging him to abandon the aircraft and bail out immediately. But Hayes glanced at the critically wounded, unconscious Martinez in the fuselage and shook his head. If they bailed out, they would land in German-occupied France, where they would almost certainly be taken prisoner. Worse still, Martinez, with his severe shoulder wound, was physically incapable of completing a parachute jump. To abandon the aircraft would be to sentence him to certain death. Lieutenant Hayes keyed the intercom and issued his order to the entire crew. They would abandon the idea of bailing out, hold the bomber steady, and continue flying toward the British mainland. Even if there was only the slimmest glimmer of hope, he would bring every single one of them home. At the very same moment the B-17 crew was trapped in this desperate situation, Lieutenant James Howell, piloting his P-47 Jersey 27, was flying toward the British mainland with the returning escort formation. As his gaze swept across the airspace below, he caught sight of the B-17, trailing black smoke, steadily losing altitude, and falling further and further behind the main formation. He knew all too well what awaited a straggling bomber. Over the course of his previous 72 combat missions, he had witnessed it countless times. A lone bomber cut off from the formation would be swarmed by German fighters, ultimately disintegrating in a mid-air explosion or plummeting to the ground with almost no chance of survival. The 10 crewmen aboard this B-17 were marching step by step towards certain death, and he was the only person on Earth who could give them even a sliver of hope. But at that moment, his fuel gauge told him he had just 58 minutes of flight time remaining. If he stayed the course with the returning formation, he would land safely at his airfield in the UK. If he broke formation, turned around, and flew to escort the damaged B-17, he would not have nearly enough fuel to complete the escort and still make it back to Britain. More importantly, his actions would be a gross violation of combat regulations. To leave the return formation without authorization and penetrate deep into German-occupied airspace meant that, if he was shot down or captured by the Germans, he would face not just no commendation, but a court-martial. One path led to guaranteed safety and a return home. The other led to a desperate rescue mission against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Howell hesitated for just a few seconds before making his decision. He hauled back on the control stick, guided his P-47 out of the return formation, reversed course, pushed the throttle to full military power, and charged at full speed toward the defenseless B-17. He tuned into the bomber formation's common communications channel, keyed his microphone, and spoke slowly, every word clear and unshakable. B-17 crew, this is Jersey 27. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to see you home. Those words were a life or death promise. At that moment, the damaged B-17 was still 90 miles from the northwest coastline of Britain. Flying at a ground speed of 140 knots, it would take a minimum of 38 minutes just to reach the airspace over the English Channel. Howell had only 58 minutes of fuel remaining. This meant that even if they encountered no enemy contact for the entire flight, with no extra fuel consumption from combat maneuvers, the fuel he had left after escorting the bomber to the English Channel would never be enough to get him back to the British mainland. That was before accounting for the very real risk of being swarmed by German fighters at any moment. Once they entered a dogfight, full throttle would burn through his fuel at double the rate, and his ammunition would be depleted just as quickly. This promise was, in and of itself, a high-stakes gamble with his own life on the line. Every member of Hayes's crew froze when they heard the voice over the radio. They watched as the silver P-47 streaked into position off their bomber's rear quarter, taking up a protective escort stance, shielding the blind spot where they were most vulnerable to attack. Pilot Lieutenant Hayes immediately grabbed his microphone and spoke to Howell. Jersey 27, we appreciate the support, but we're in bad shape, and you don't have nearly enough fuel. Turn around and head back now. Don't die out here with us." Howell's reply was simple, unwavering, and final. "I'll stay with you to the border until you're safe." The words had barely left his mouth when disaster struck. Three Bf-109 fighters burst through the cloud cover, having locked onto the straggling B-17. Flying in a tight Vic formation, they launched an attack from the rear quarter. The German pilots clearly had not expected a lone P-47 to be escorting the cut-off bomber. Howell did not hesitate for a split second. He slammed the control stick forward, pushed the throttle to the stops, and charged straight at the incoming German formation at full speed. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared at a deafening pitch, unleashing all 2,000 horsepower, sending the fighter hurtling toward the enemy like an arrow loosed from a bow. Howell seized the high-side attack position, lined up his sights on the leftmost Bf-109 in the formation, and squeezed the firing trigger at a range of 300 yards. All 8 of his 12.7mm heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously, a dense hail of bullets engulfing the target in an instant. The Bf-109 took dozens of direct hits to its fuselage. Its cockpit was torn open, and the pilot was killed instantly. The fighter immediately went out of control, plummeting toward the ground, trailing thick black smoke. The remaining 2 Bf-109 pilots, stunned by the ferocity of the P-47's attack and the instant loss of one of their own, immediately abandoned their assault. They wheeled around in a panic, dove back into the cloud cover, and vanished from the airspace. In the first dogfight, Howell had successfully broken the attack in less than 30 seconds. But by now, his fuel gauge had dropped to just 42 minutes of flight time remaining, and he had only 28 seconds of continuous firing time left for his machine guns. He guided his fighter back into the protective escort position off the B-17's rear quarter, and they continued their flight toward the British mainland. The B-17's altitude had already dropped from 23,000 feet to 18,000 feet, and its speed still could not exceed 140 knots. Every passing second brought them one step closer to disaster. Barely 8 minutes later, the second crisis hit. A formation of 5 Bf-109s came streaking straight toward them from dead ahead, employing the Luftwaffe's most deadly, classic, head-on attack tactic, their target fixed squarely on the B-17 ahead. The 5 fighters flew in a tight line abreast formation, all their nose-mounted 20mm cannons trained on the bomber. Once they entered firing range, the storm of cannon fire would tear the already damaged B-17 to shreds in an instant. At that moment, Howell's P-47 was positioned off the bomber's rear quarter. There was no way he could circle around in front of the B-17 to intercept the attack in time. In this hair-raising, do-or-die moment, Howell executed an utterly insane tactical maneuver. He slammed the control stick forward, pushed the throttle to full power, and guided his P-47 screaming directly over the top of the bomber, launching a head-on charge straight at the 5 oncoming Bf-109s. The 2 formations were flying directly toward each other at a closing speed of over 500 knots, 926 kilometers per hour. At that speed, even a bird strike to the fuselage could cause catastrophic damage, let alone a collision between 2 fully armed fighter aircraft. The German pilots had clearly not anticipated such a suicidal, reckless move from the American pilot, and their attack formation was thrown into complete disarray in an instant. Howell squeezed the trigger first at a range of 800 yards. All 8 heavy machine guns opened up in a sustained burst, sending a long stream of tracers streaking toward the German formation. The oncoming enemy fighters fired back simultaneously, 20mm cannon rounds and 12.7mm bullets, weaving a lethal web of steel in the airspace between the 2 opposing forces. A single second before the aircraft collided head-on, Howell hauled back hard on the control stick, sending the P-47 screaming upward in a climb, blasting past the German fighters a mere 10 meters apart at their closest point. In that split-second head-on pass, Howell's hail of fire found its mark with pinpoint accuracy on a Bf-109 in the center of the formation. The enemy fighter had its wings sheared clean off, disintegrating in a mid-air fireball on the spot. The remaining 4 Bf-109s were thrown into complete disarray by the insane head-on charge, their carefully planned head-on attack left in tatters. Howell immediately guided his fighter through a high-speed barrel roll, latched onto the tail of one of the remaining Bf-109s, and opened fire once more. A second enemy aircraft took direct hits, its engine bursting into flames before it plummeted toward the ground. After 5 minutes of dogfighting, Howell had shot down 2 of the 5 attacking Bf-109s. Combined with the one he had downed earlier, the Germans had lost a total of 3 fighters. The remaining 3 German pilots, staring down the seemingly unhinged P-47 before them, lost their stomach for the fight. They wheeled around and retreated from the battlefield. In the second dogfight, Howell had once again taken on 5 enemies alone and successfully defended the B-17. But by now, the noose was tightening with every passing minute. The B-17's altitude had dropped to 16,000 feet, with 65 miles still to go to the English Channel. Howell had just 28 minutes of fuel remaining, and his ammunition was down to the last few rounds. Lieutenant Hayes again keyed the radio, pleading with Howell to turn back at the top of his lungs. "Jersey 27, you've done more than enough. If you don't leave now, you'll never make it home. Turn around immediately." Howell's reply held not a single flicker of hesitation. "As long as I'm here, you're safe. I'll see you to the border." As he spoke, he drew on every ounce of his flight experience, tweaking the fighter's throttle, fuel-air mixture, and propeller pitch, optimizing fuel efficiency bit by bit, all to squeeze just a few more seconds of flight time from his nearly empty tanks. He knew there was no turning back now. The only thing he could do was hold on until the bomber reached the English Channel, until the German fighters abandoned their pursuit for good. He would use the last of his fuel and ammunition to hold the final line of defense for this stricken bomber. The most brutal dogfight of all erupted 10 minutes later. A hunter-killer flight of 6 Bf-109s dove down from high altitude. They had clearly locked onto their target and came fully prepared to shoot down both the straggling B-17 and the lone P-47, fighting against all odds. The 6 fighters split into 2 3-plane formations, one tasked with drawing Howell's attention, the other streaking straight for the defenseless B-17 bomber. By this point, Howell had less than 20 seconds of continuous firing time left for his machine guns. He had no room for error. Every burst had to count. Once his ammunition ran out, both he and the B-17 were doomed. Staring down the diving German fighters, Howell abandoned all fuel conservation entirely, shoving the throttle to the absolute stops. The engine screamed as it pushed to its absolute limits, and he guided the fighter into a full-speed charge straight at the 3-plane formation bearing down on the B-17. He lined up his sights on the lead Bf-109 and squeezed the trigger at a range of 250 yards. A short, devastatingly accurate burst from all 8 machine guns sent dozens of rounds slamming into the enemy fighter's cockpit and engine. The lead Bf-109 immediately went out of control, plummeting straight toward the ground. The German attack formation was thrown into disarray once more, and the 3-plane formation tasked with distracting Howell immediately wheeled around and dove straight for his P-47. All 6 fighters now had Howell surrounded in a tight circle. While Howell was locked in a dogfight with the German fighters, the remaining 2 Bf-109s seized the gap and launched their attack on the B-17. 20mm cannon rounds once again tore into the B-17's fuselage, with one round scoring a direct hit on the No. 2 engine. An explosion rang out, and the No. 2 engine burst into flames instantly, the fire spreading rapidly despite the crew's every effort to extinguish it. Lieutenant Hayes had no choice but to order the fuel lines and electrical switches to the number 2 engine shut down, abandoning the engine entirely. With that, the B-17 had lost 2 of its 4 engines, with only the number 1 and 4 engines on the far left and right wings still sputtering along. Deprived of half its power, the bomber's flight state deteriorated in an instant. The airframe fell into a severe imbalance, its rate of descent accelerating rapidly. Its altitude plummeted from 16,000 feet to just 9,000 feet in moments, with 42 miles still remaining to the British coast. At the bomber's current speed, it would take a minimum of 18 minutes to reach safety. On the other side of the fight, Howell, now surrounded by 6 Bf-109s, was trapped in his own desperate situation. His ammunition was all but gone, and his fighter had taken 2 direct hits from German cannon fire. One round had torn into the wing, the other had punched through the rear fuselage. Miraculously, neither had struck the engine or the cockpit, the P-47's legendary rugged airframe saving his life. Watching the German fighters lining up for another attack run on the B-17, Howell made his final stand. He guided his fighter through an extreme, near-stall turn, latched onto the tail of a Bf-109, and unleashed the very last of his ammunition at point-blank range of 150 yards. The hail of fire struck the Bf-109 with pinpoint accuracy, puncturing its fuel tanks and igniting an instant inferno, the aircraft exploding and disintegrating mid-air. That was the 4th German fighter Howell had shot down, and it had exhausted the very last of his ammunition. There was not a single round left in his machine guns. Of the 6 Bf-109s, he had shot down 2. Combined with their earlier losses, the Germans had paid a devastating price of 6 fighters at the hands of this lone, defiant P-47. More importantly, after the extended dogfight, the German fighters were also critically low on fuel, unable to continue the pursuit. The remaining 4 Bf-109s ultimately chose to abandon the attack, wheeling around toward their German airfield and vanishing from the airspace entirely. The immediate crisis was over, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. When the dogfight ended, Howell's fuel gauge showed just 11 minutes of flight time remaining. The B-17, meanwhile, still had 42 miles to the British coast, a journey that would take 18 minutes to complete. The fuel deficit was impossible to overcome. Even if he turned around immediately, he would never make it back to an airfield on the British mainland. His only options were to crash land in German-occupied France and become a prisoner of war, or run out of fuel and plunge into the English Channel, lost to the sea. Every member of Hayes's crew fell silent as they watched the fuel-starved P-47 flying beside them. They knew this young pilot had condemned himself to almost certain death to save them. Lieutenant Hayes picked up his microphone once more, his voice cracking with emotion. "Jersey 27, we can never repay what you've done for us. You still have a chance. Find a place to put down on the French coast. At least you'll save your life. Don't go down with us in the Channel." Howell stared ahead at the B-17, still steadily losing altitude, then down at the coastline of German-occupied France below, and made his final decision. He keyed his microphone, his voice calm and unwavering. "I'm not putting down in France. I'm going to ditch in the Channel with you. If we go down in the same area, the rescue craft have a better chance of finding us all. We came out here together. We're going back together." With those words, he had fully and irrevocably surrendered his last chance at survival. A crash landing in German-occupied territory would have let him live at the very least. Even as a prisoner of war, he would have held out hope of returning home after the war. But a ditching in the frigid waters of the English Channel was another matter entirely. The P-47's airframe was never built to withstand the impact of a water landing. Once it hit the water, it would almost certainly break apart and sink instantly, leaving only the slimmest margin of survival. Even so, he chose to walk into the abyss, side by side with the crew he had sworn to protect, to live or die together. Minutes later, the B-17 crossed the coastline of German-occupied France, officially entering the airspace over the English Channel. At that exact moment, German coastal anti-aircraft guns on the ground opened up with one final barrage. Dense flak rounds exploded all around the bomber, shrapnel tearing through the B-17's fuselage once more. Waist gunner Briggs was hit in the leg by shrapnel, critically wounded on the spot. The bomber's altitude plummeted again, down to just 6,000 feet. Howell's fuel, meanwhile, had dropped below the critical threshold, with just 5 minutes of flight time remaining. They were still 28 miles from the British coast. There was no turning back now. He could only follow the B-17 forward until the last of his fuel was gone. The B-17's altitude continued its relentless fall. 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 2,000 feet. Lieutenant Hayes and co-pilot Morrison fought with every fiber of their being to hold the two-engine bomber in level flight. They knew they would never make it to the British coast. Their only option was to execute a water ditching in the English Channel. Lieutenant Hayes keyed the intercom and issued the ditching order to the entire crew. The crew sprang into action immediately, shutting down all non-essential electrical circuits and fuel lines, securing every unsecured item in the fuselage, and moving the wounded gunners to the center of the aircraft to brace for impact. Every man put on their life vest, ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. All except Martinez, still unconscious in the ball turret. With the turret's hydraulic system destroyed, the gunners had no way to open the turret from the outside and pull him free. The ball turret was mounted on the underside of the bomber's fuselage, and the moment the aircraft hit the water in a ditching, the turret would be the first part of the plane crushed and deformed by the force of the sea. The gunner inside had almost no chance of survival. It was the death trap of any B-17 water ditching, and Martinez was trapped inside it. At the same time, Howell's P-47 blared its fuel exhaustion warning. The roar of the engine faded little by little before falling silent entirely. The propeller froze mid-spin, and the fighter lost all power, reduced to a glider with abysmal glide performance. Howell gripped the control stick white-knuckled, fighting to hold the aircraft's flight attitude, following the B-17 off its rear quarter and descending in lockstep toward the sea. He had no room left for error, relying solely on his decades of flight experience to pull off this final, most dangerous ditching of his career. 15:47 hours, 12th of October, 1943, over the North Sea waters of the English Channel. The scene that opened this story had finally arrived. Lieutenant Hayes and co-pilot Morrison locked eyes, then hauled back on the control stick in unison, guiding the B-17 into the frigid sea at roughly 100 knots. The fuselage held perfectly parallel to the water's surface. A deafening crash ripped through the air as the B-17's belly struck the water first. The colossal impact wrenched the entire airframe, shearing away rivets at the skin seams in an instant, and tearing dozens of gashes in the fuselage skin along both sides of the aircraft. The bomber skipped twice across the surface of the sea, each bounce inflicting further structural damage, before finally sliding 300 yards across the water and grinding to a complete halt. Freezing seawater poured into the cabin through the dozens of holes in the fuselage. The bullet-riddled flying fortress had lost all buoyancy the moment it hit the water, with less than 2 minutes before it would sink to the bottom of the channel entirely. The crew did not hesitate for a second, immediately beginning their evacuation. The cockpit glass had shattered on impact, and Hayes and Morrison were the first to free themselves from their harnesses, climbing out through the broken cockpit. The crew in the mid-fuselage opened the top escape hatch, dragging the 2 wounded gunners with them as they climbed out of the aircraft one by one. They quickly pulled the inflation tabs on their life rafts, the orange inflatable vessels deploying rapidly across the surface of the sea, and every man climbed aboard in turn. It was only then that they confirmed the worst. Martinez, in the bellyball turret, had been killed instantly on impact. The sea had crushed the turret beyond recognition, his body trapped inside, destined to sink to the bottom of the icy North Sea with the doomed bomber. In the end, of the 10-man crew, 9 made it safely to the life rafts. 1 had made the ultimate sacrifice. At the exact same time the B-17 ditched, Howell's P-47 struck the sea. The fighter's nose hit the water first, and the 2,000-pound engine beneath it generated an immediate, catastrophic downward force, flipping the entire aircraft inverted and slamming it upside down into the water, where it began to sink fast. Howell's head had slammed hard into the gun sight ahead of him on impact, leaving him bleeding heavily and briefly unconscious. The freezing seawater flooding into the cockpit jolted Howell back to awareness in an instant. He immediately freed himself from his seatbelt and flight harness, groping for the canopy release in the inverted cockpit, and fought with every last ounce of his strength to climb out of the sinking fighter. Mere seconds after he broke the surface of the water, his P-47, Jersey 27, sank to the bottom of the English Channel, leaving nothing but a spreading ripple across the waves. Fighting through the searing pain in his head and the creeping hypothermia from the icy water, Howell spotted the orange life raft not far away. He summoned the last of his strength and swam toward it. The crew aboard the raft immediately reached out, hauling him to safety. The 9 men of the B-17 crew stared at the pilot before them, bleeding from the head, soaked to the bone, and utterly exhausted. Every single one of them came to attention and rendered him a crisp, regulation military salute. They knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that not a single one of them would be alive in that life raft were it not for this man, who had defied orders and charged alone into the abyss to save them. Howell looked back at them, smiled weakly, and returned the salute. He spoke just one sentence. "I told you I'd see you home." They floated in the 10 degrees Celsius water for 18 minutes before a Royal Air Force rescue launch appeared on the horizon in the distance. The launch spotted the orange life raft on the water, speeding toward them and pulling every single man aboard. When Hayes recounted Howell's extraordinary feat to the launch's captain, the Royal Navy officer came to attention and rendered a solemn salute to the pilot, paying the highest possible tribute to the man who had single-handedly pulled off a miracle on the battlefield. 3 days after the incident, the U.S. 8th Air Force held a decoration ceremony for Lieutenant James Howell. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States military's second highest combat honor, second only to the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "Lieutenant James Howell, in combat operations on October 12, 1943, demonstrated extraordinary heroism, fearless devotion to duty, and a sense of mission far beyond the call of duty. He defied orders to return to base, flying alone to the aid of a damaged friendly bomber. Against overwhelming odds, he engaged and destroyed 4 enemy aircraft, carving out a corridor of life and death for the friendly crew, and ultimately made a selfless decision that saved the lives of 9 of his brothers in arms. His actions embody the finest fighting spirit and military honor of the United States Army Air Forces." Every single one of the 9 B-17 crewmen Howell had saved was in attendance at the ceremony. They stood in perfect formation, came to attention, and saluted Howell once more. The desperate escort mission that began over the Rhineland had finally come to a close. After the war, Lieutenant James Howell completed his combat tours and returned safely to the United States, settling into civilian life. He rarely spoke of the harrowing battle to anyone. When asked about the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to his chest, he would always smile and change the subject, never boasting of his extraordinary feat. For their part, the 9 B-17 crewmen he had saved, and their families, sent him a Christmas card every single year without fail, right up until his death in 1998. For 55 years, they honored that life-saving debt that crossed the line between life and death, never forgetting that 90-mile flight through the valley of the shadow of death. From a tactical perspective, This desperate escort mission perfectly showcased the performance advantages of both the B-17 bomber and the P-47 fighter. The B-17, with its legendary ruggedness, sustained multiple direct cannon hits, flak blasts, the loss of 2 engines, and a total hydraulic failure, yet still completed a long-distance flight and water ditching, proving its nickname as the Flying Fortress in the heat of combat. The P-47, meanwhile, with its raw power, robust airframe protection, and devastating firepower, successfully held off German Bf-109 fighters in multiple outnumbered dogfights, cementing its reputation as one of the finest piston-engine fighters of World War II in real combat. This battle also laid bare the fatal flaw in the USAAF's daylight bombing strategy: the insufficient range of its escort fighters. The P-47's limited escort radius left the bomber fleet unprotected for the majority of its mission deep inside Germany, forced to endure relentless attacks from German fighters and pay a devastating price in casualties. This battle, alongside the Second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, became a defining catalyst for the development and deployment of the U.S. military's long-range escort fighters. Soon after, the ultra-long-range P-51 Mustang entered service with U.S. forces, bringing a definitive end to the Luftwaffe's hunting dominance over American bomber fleets and turning the tide of the air war over the Western Front of Europe. In terms of strategic significance, this aerial escort battle over the Rhineland on 12 October 1943, though a tiny footnote among the countless battles of the air war over the Western Front in World War II, stands as one of the most moving legends in the history of aerial combat. Across 90 miles of escort flight, 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, and 9 lives saved, it encapsulates the spirit of sacrifice that transcends even courage on the battlefield, and the soldier's creed: no brother left behind. Even in the cold, unforgiving cruelty of war, there are choices like this, oaths like this, promises like this. They cut through the fire and smoke of battle, through more than 80 years of time, and still let us feel the searing heat of the honor and brotherhood that burns in the heart of every soldier. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.